When Charles Darwin was a young man, he was very religious. He became less so over the course of his life. This wasn't all due to his observations about evolution, but they had a significant influence. He says, "Whilst on the Beagle, I was quite orthodox, and I remember being heartily laughed at by several of the officers, though themselves orthodox, for quoting the Bible as an unanswerable authority on some point of morality. But I gradually came by this time, that is 1836 to 1839, to see that the Old Testament was no more to be trusted than the sacred books of the Hindus. The Bible makes a lot of miraculous claims that testimony alone cannot adequately support, and Darwin notes that even by the standards by which testimonial evidence is weighed, the Bible is a very poor account. By further reflecting that the clearest evidence would be requisite to make any sane man believe in the miracles by which Christianity is supported, and that the more we know of the fixed laws of nature, the more incredible do miracles become, that the men at the time were ignorant and credulous to a degree almost incomprehensible by us, that the Gospels cannot be proved to have been written simultaneously with the events, that they differ in many important details, far too important, as it seemed to me, to be admitted as the usual inaccuracies of eyewitnesses. By such reflections as these, which I gave not as having the least novelty or value, but as they influenced me, I gradually became to disbelieve in Christianity as a divine revelation. The fact that many false religions have spread over large portions of the earth like wildfire had some weight with me. The theory of evolution is, of course, the strongest rebuttal to the argument from design. The old argument from design and nature, as given by Paley, which formerly seemed to me to be so conclusive, fails now that the law of natural selection has been discovered. We can no longer argue that, for instance, the beautiful hinge of a bivalve shell must have been made by an intelligent being, like the hinge of a door by a man. There seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course which the wind blows. More recently, many creationist writers argue that Darwin didn't know about all the complex chemistry that is necessary to many physiological functions, as though this effectively revives the argument from design. Creationists claim that organisms have features which are irreducibly complex and therefore cannot be the product of gradual evolution. All of these examples, however, assume that the function of every mechanism was the same throughout its development. They assume, for example, that the parts of the bacterial flagellum always serve the function of the bacterial flagellum, when in fact there are many other functions they can perform if you were to remove parts from the mechanism. Darwin also questioned how an all-powerful, all-loving God would allow suffering. Some writers indeed are so much impressed with the amount of suffering in the world that they doubt, if we look at all sentient beings, whether there is more of misery or more of happiness, whether the world as a whole is a good one or bad one. According to my judgment, happiness decidedly prevails, though this would be very difficult to prove. If the truth of this conclusion be granted, it harmonizes well with the effects which we might expect from natural selection. If all the individuals of any species were habitually to suffer to an extreme degree, they would neglect to propagate their kind, but we have no reason to believe that this has ever, or at least often, occurred. Such suffering is quite compatible with the belief in natural selection, which is not perfect in its action, but tends only to render each species as successful as possible in the battle for life with other species, in wonderfully complex and changing circumstances. That there is much suffering in the world no one disputes. Some have attempted to explain this with reference to man by imagining that it serves for his moral improvement, but the number of men in the world is as nothing compared with that of all other sentient beings, and they often suffer greatly without any moral improvement. An unintelligent process that does not care about the well-being of the organisms it produces seems far more consistent with the fact that suffering exists than the idea that we were created by an intelligent, caring entity. William Lane Craig says that what convinces him more than anything else that a God exists is the witness of the Holy Spirit. He just feels that a God exists. People were saying this back in Darwin's time as well. At the present day, the most usual argument for the existence of an intelligent God is drawn from the deep inward conviction and feelings which are experienced by most persons. This argument would be a valid one if all men of all races had the same inward conviction of the existence of one God. But we know that this is very far from being the case. Therefore, I cannot see such inward conviction and feelings are of any weight as evidence of what really exists. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.